Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We have a really special episode for you today, and I'm particularly excited to be bringing this one to you. We have a special guest, Dr. Ken Richkus, the Chief of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Division of Migratory Bird Management. Y'all will remember probably that we had Ken on last year to discuss cancellation of the 2020 Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. A lot of our loyal listeners will probably know by this time that we have another year where the survey we've not been able to conduct the survey. And we spoke with Frank Baldwin of the Canadian Wildlife Service recently to get his perspective north of the border on kind of what went into some of those decisions. But the Fish and Wildlife Service is certainly one of the lead agencies on this survey, and we're responsible for making some of the decisions regarding their participation in the survey this year and the ultimate cancellation of it. And so we felt it was appropriate to try to get Ken in to share some of that perspective. And we've been able to make our schedules align, and very happy to have Ken with us here today. So welcome back to the podcast, Ken. Thanks for joining us.
Great, Mike. It's great to be here today, and always happy to join you about talking about ducks and other issues affecting waterfowl conservation. But unfortunately, it seems to be, again, for less than desirable reasons.
Yeah, well, that's I think we're all becoming accustomed to unusual events and unusual conversations, and hopefully conversations that we won't have to revisit very often in the future, or if at all in the future in this regard. So thanks again for joining us. And in terms of your position, I'll just kind of restate, you're the Chief of the Division of Migratory Bird Management for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. When we had you on the podcast last year, we went into a bit more detail about your personal and professional background and the career track that you've been on. We're not going to do that again, but we'll just say that your division, the Division of Migratory Bird Management, is the one within the Fish and Wildlife Service that is responsible for a lot of the decisions and a lot of the management of, naturally, migratory birds, and certainly waterfowl fall under that under that banner. So you are the relevant person to help us with this conversation. So we're going to jump right into the conversation here. And as I mentioned, this is not our first rodeo. We went through this last year. And when we had you on last year, Ken, I think we were all anticipating that 2021 would allow us to get back in the air to conduct the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey, which is, of course, the survey that gives us our May pond numbers and our breeding waterfowl population numbers from across North America. And here's where I want you to kind of take us through the steps of, what was happening within your division, and what ultimately got canceled. So I guess that's at the high point. Or to start off here, give us an update on the status of the survey, which ones were canceled, and were there any that you were able to conduct? So let's just start right there, high level.
You bet. And Mike, as you pointed out, 2020 was certainly a challenging year on many fronts. And as you mentioned, we did unfortunately have to cancel this survey last year. And, right when we were planning to do the May survey in 2020, that was early into the pandemic. I know a lot of us down here in the U.S. were under stay-at-home orders, different restrictions in different states. I think as a country, we didn't know a whole lot about the coronavirus and how it was transmitted. So I think last year when we did make the decision to cancel some of our major monitoring programs, it was really done out of an abundance of caution to help protect our employees, the North American public, and then also adhere to some of the state restrictions that were in place. I know, unfortunately, last year we did have to cancel several of our major monitoring programs, the Mid-Continent Sandhill Crane Survey, obviously the May Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. We canceled several of the goose surveys that are associated with the May survey, like the Ungava AP Goose Survey up on the Ungava Peninsula. USGS also had to really cancel the breeding bird survey effort across the U.S. and Canada as well. So lots of disruptions last year. Since that time, we've really learned more, I think, about the coronavirus and how COVID was transmitted. And we were able to use a lot of that to put COVID mitigation measures into place. And actually do risk assessments. So we spent a bunch of this last year really trying to figure out how to get back into the field and do it safely. We did end up resuming flight status there at the end of 2020, and we're able to get folks into the field and back into airplanes doing what they do best. I know we had to modify some efforts, reduce the number of observers that we had in some aircraft. Obviously, we had some mask mandates in aircraft as well, but for the most part, we were able to resume, especially some of the simpler type surveys. Some of our more complex surveys, we still postpone. Some of the eagle surveys that we do for both bald and golden eagles really involve multiple observers and multiple crews and moving around. So those got to be more complex, but a lot of the simpler surveys that we could do. So I think moving into 2021, we were all very optimistic that we would be able to resume to the May survey here this past year. And really things were looking pretty good. Their COVID numbers were starting to track in the right direction here in the U.S. And in Canada for the most part. Vaccine rollout was in full swing in the U.S. And we were all very optimistic that we'd be able to pull things off. But unfortunately there come mid-March, early April, I know we started having some new variants that were impacting Canada pretty hard. A lot of the provinces up there in Canada certainly had some restrictions regarding travel. And the border still effectively remained closed with Canada, which ultimately ended up being one of the major reasons we did end up canceling our participation in the May waterfowl breeding population habitat survey this year in Canada. That was the big driver.
Yeah, I want to explore that a little bit more because as I told Frank Baldwin, one of the primary reasons why I think it's important to have this conversation and hear from the Canadian Wildlife Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service directly is to share with people some insight onto the actual decisions that were being made and how those decisions are made, why they're made, and in some cases, who's making them. I think it's easy for those of us that are passionate about waterfowl hunting, and that look forward to these data every year to find fault and find criticism with the government. I mean, the government takes hits every day, right? That's always a fashionable thing to do, and so this is no different. And so I've heard and I've seen some comments about people criticizing the Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, about not being on their game and sitting back, and it's unimaginable to think how they cannot be geared up in time to conduct this survey. You've had an entire year to think about it, and I understand that. I understand sort of the off the cuff reaction of that nature, again, because it's fashionable to be critical of government agencies at any level, but that's not a, I guess you'd say, factual representation of what actually went down here. The agencies were gearing up to do the surveys, and then we had a resurgence of the virus in Canada, which really caused, it threw a huge wrench into the logistics of how this survey has to be conducted. I think it's important for people to realize that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the agency that provides the planes, they provide the pilots, they provide the observers, and you have to think about national sovereignty of airspace and those types of things. Ken, tell us how that works. You as in the Fish and Wildlife Service can't just hop in a plane and fly north of the border into the airspace of Canada and start counting the surveys, can you?
Not at all. And Mike, as you pointed out, really the May surveys every year really is a cooperative effort, primarily between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Canadian Wildlife Service. But we also involve the participation of a lot of the different states, as you mentioned, the Great Lakes states, and then California, Washington, and Oregon in the West. So it really does involve a tremendous amount of coordination amongst all the different players. But as you mentioned, we were planning, full steam ahead and really optimistic that we could pull off the May survey this year. I know we were in constant communication with Canadian Wildlife Service staff at multiple levels throughout the agency, planning for the May survey, and then getting, constant updates on the Canadian Wildlife Service's ability to do field work and whether or not, we would actually be able to get into the country. I know I talked to folks in Canadian Wildlife Service headquarters at least weekly, if not more. And then we were in contact with some of the folks in the field offices almost daily planning. Also, as you mentioned, Mike, these surveys are pretty complex. You just can't hop in an aircraft and then go up there and start counting ducks. It does involve several months of planning. Just from the logistics side, I know we have to get insurance to operate aircraft in Canada. We have to work with the State Department and the U.S. and Canadian embassies to get the country clearances that we need. We actually have to submit names of pilots and observers that all have to be cleared. And this is on a normal year too. So that whole process does take months to put into place. So we were, like I said, planning to move forward, and we were watching the situation in Canada pretty closely. Ultimately, the deciding factor was the fact that CWS did not get the approval that they were hoping for to get out there and do field work because of the COVID trends in the provinces across Canada and some of the restrictions that were in place. I know the border was effectively closed. There was some limited travel back and forth across the border, really for essential purposes only. But if you were able to get across the border, there was 2 weeks of quarantine involved. Often you needed to stay in one place within a province. And of course, our pilots don't do that. So we enter Canada and largely start traveling from south to north. And I know that caused some concern because the last thing, we wanted to do, or Canadian Wildlife Service wanted to do, would be the vector to further spread COVID and become, an additional burden on the Canadian healthcare system. So really, I think it was that decision right there, the fact that CWS could not get the approval that they needed to do the field work, and a decision was made in the interest of the Canadian public not to get out there in the field, and really that caused us to kind of rethink other options. So we were always optimistic that we'd do the survey, but I know through the last 4 or 5 months, we spent a lot of time doing contingency planning. What if we couldn't get into Canada? What would we do? What if Canadian Wildlife Service employees were able to get out there and do groundwork in Canada? Could we come up with a population estimate just based on the groundwork only? Would it be feasible to, just fly the U.S. only portions of the survey and come up with an estimate that way? So we were all hoping that we'd pull off a full survey, but we had several teams kind of across both organizations, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Canadian Wildlife Service, coming up with different contingencies.
Yeah, those are all great points. Thanks for providing that clarification or those details, Ken. And that your insight combined with Frank really gives us a complete picture of what went into those decisions. As you mentioned, the Canadian Wildlife Service was not able to get approval for their field work, and that those decisions came at a level much higher than their own agency. So these things were out of the control of the agencies that were responsible for conducting the surveys. And I know the Canadian government was particularly concerned about those northern communities, those indigenous communities where they don't have access to great health care. And if something were to get transmitted into those remote locations, then boy, that's a huge issue and huge risk. And so it's the complexity of the survey during any normal year, I think, exceeds most people's, including my, appreciation. And when you throw a global pandemic into the mix, I mean, it just becomes unmanageable in many respects. And I think that's what we saw over 2 consecutive years.
That's kind of where we landed. And I know we are still in pretty close contact with Canadian Wildlife Service. I know the border situation gets reevaluated monthly, if not weekly. And we are still planning, especially kind of turning our attention to banding and what might be possible there and what contingencies we may need to make there.
In terms of contingency planning related to the survey, Ken, there was some discussion that I had heard about, could we do a U.S. prairie only survey? And would we be able to get enough data from that? But, from my understanding, there was sort of a risk-reward kind of assessment there, and ultimately, when you think about the risk that these flights, that these surveys pose to biologists and observers and the pilots to begin with, and then coupled with the challenges that it would presented for drawing conclusions at a continental level from just a small segment of that population, I think ultimately y'all just decided that wasn't going to be worth doing. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. We looked at multiple contingencies and certainly flying the U.S. only portion in North and South Dakota and Montana was one contingency that we looked at. As you know, Mike, unfortunately, ducks are not uniformly distributed across the breeding grounds. And a lot of those species settle where the water wetland conditions are favorable. So one of the dangers of sitting there and just flying North and South Dakota, Montana, and then expanding that, across the entire breeding range to come up with an estimate is the fact you'd end up with a biased, potentially a biased estimate. So that was a real concern, but that was a contingency that we did look at. And you're right. These surveys cost money. Our pilots are out there flying at 100 miles an hour at 100 feet. And if you were to have an issue and something go wrong, I think you have about 6 seconds to react and put the plane down safely. And I don't think the Fish and Wildlife Service I didn't want to take that risk and put our pilots in danger for information that probably couldn't be used to inform harvest management decisions.
And that's a great segue, Ken, to the next thing that I wanted to talk about here, which is how the lack of data from last year as well as this year is affecting harvest regulations. We're recording this here in mid-June. Harvest regulations here in the United States and in Canada as well, as Frank Baldwin talked about, but we're just going to be speaking about the Fish and Wildlife, or the U.S. regulations here. The regulations for 21-22 are already set. There's a new process, new timeline for which regulations are being set, and that continues to be a topic in our mind on our list of things to really dig into detail on. We don't want to get into the, into the weeds on why we're doing it that way now, but that is the case where our 21-22 regulations are set based on data on ponds and habitat condition, ponds and population sizes in the previous breeding season. In this case, would be 2020. How is all of this affecting the Fish and Wildlife Service's ability to set those regulations, and what does this second consecutive year without observational data mean for our ability to confidently set regulations for the 22-23 season?
Well, as you mentioned, Mike, we did go through this last year, and we spent a fair bit of time looking for ways to make a good, defensible decision regarding harvest management back in for the 21-22 season, this upcoming hunting season. So we spent a lot of time working with the flyway tech sections and flyway councils, exploring some options. And at least for waterfowl, especially ducks in particular, we are incredibly fortunate to have such rich long-term data sets. We've been banding ducks since the 1930s. We've been conducting population surveys, May surveys, since the mid-1950s. We've been conducting a lot of our harvest surveys since the 1960s. So we have these really rich long-term data sets that allow us to help make population predictions on what we think the population could be. So even in the absence of having that May survey data, we were still able to forecast what we think population size should be. And again, May surveys were canceled, so we didn't have that population estimate, but a lot of the other harvest surveys that we do, like harvest surveys and banding, where we get the harvest rates, survival rates, were conducted last year. And we were able to take a lot of that information and really forecast population size and hopefully make really good harvest management considerations with the support and conjunction of our partners in the flyways. So that's really how we made the decision last year, and I suspect we'll be doing very much the same here this year. And when you take all those long-term data sets and are able to forecast like that, it does give you a fair bit of power to hopefully make good decisions in the absence of information.
One thing that I'll say here, Ken, that in the position that I'm in, I talk with a few people about what's going on. They ask me about the surveys and what can I update them on. And of course, I get all my information from folks like you and the state, our state partners and our Canadian Wildlife Service partners. One of the questions that has come up rather persistently, and I know you've heard it, I know some of your staff have heard it, I've actually talked with them about it. And this is the idea of, okay, well, we're not able to get up in the plains to conduct the surveys this year, can we use remotely sensed data to estimate the number of ponds that are out there? And I'm sure that's running through the mind of some of our savvy listeners. Like, why can't we just use satellite imagery, which is collected more frequently now, to estimate the number of ponds? Because one of the things that we'll talk about here in just a moment is this developing drought, and that's on people's minds right now. What I can tell you and what I can tell our listeners is it's not that simple. I think the short answer to this question is that at some point in the hopefully near future, and I'll say near future, 5 to 10 years, it would not surprise me at all if we have the ability to use some of this finer resolution satellite imagery, 10-meter resolution imagery, to get a better handle on pond numbers. But that resolution of data is still pretty new. And in order to use, even if we could do it this year, you would have to go back and develop some relationships between satellite-based data and your observed pond data, and it's not that simple. That's usually my response to people when they ask me about it. I'm like, yeah, in theory, that's possible, and I think someday we will get there. And Ken, I know your shops, your people are thinking about that, but we're not there right now, and it's going to take a few years to do so. In case people were wondering, I just wanted to throw that out there. Anything to add there, Ken?
Yeah, I will follow up on that. I know the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Division of Migratory Bird Management, we are investing pretty heavily actually in remote sensing and bringing new technologies to our survey and monitoring programs. And I would love to sit down and talk to you about that at some point. And we can probably pull in our branch chief for migratory bird surveys and pilot Mark Conniff, who's kind of leading that effort for us. But you're right. We're not quite there yet, especially to be able to use satellite data and don't quite have the resolution that we need for decision making. But you're right. We're probably not that far away from doing so. The one thing I will add, as far as helping inform this coming year's decision, we were able to incorporate U.S. and Canadian precipitation data. As you know, we go up there every year and count ponds, and that pond numbers really give us a good estimate of recruitment every year. The wetter it is, the more ponds, typically the more ducks that we have. And as you know, pond numbers correlate fairly well with precipitation data. So we were able to pull off quite a bit of the precipitation data across the U.S. and Canadian prairies and plug that into our recruitment models. So even in the absence of pond data, the drought and the dryness of the Canadian prairies and potential impact on production is still captured in that decision-making process.
I want to come back to that drought question in just a moment. But first, before I forget about it, we talked about cancellation of the surveys across most of what we call the traditional survey area. That's the prairie region. That's the Western Boreal Forest of Canada. That's the Eastern Boreal Forest of Canada. All of those surveys were canceled. But what about surveys in Alaska? Alaska is the sovereign property of the United States. We don't have to necessarily get foreign permission to conduct surveys there. What can you tell us about whether surveys were conducted in Alaska?
So we did actually conduct surveys in Alaska this year. And again, I know that took a lot of planning and logistics as well, but that is, as you know, a U.S. state. We did not need any foreign permission to get up there and fly, but there were a lot of considerations up there, especially in some of the indigenous areas, just like in northern Canada where they have limited health care. We have that same situation that exists across much of Alaska. So we're very cognizant of that in our decision making. But I am happy to report that we did get up there and fly almost all the Alaska Strata this year. That survey was completed. And where that is really useful for us is helping set harvest regulations in the Pacific Flyway. So that framework that we use to help guide harvest management decisions in the Pacific Flyway treats Alaska as a distinct group or a distinct population. So that's combined with information from state data, California, Washington, and Oregon to help inform harvest regulations for the Pacific Flyway. So we're having to do some estimation for the states that were not flown this last year, but we do have true observable data from Alaska. So that was one benefit. It should give us a little insight as to what's going on with some of these species.
What we're seeing with regard to the resumption of surveys, waterfowl surveys across the U.S. and Canada is not unlike what we're seeing with the gradual easing of travel and COVID restrictions across North America as well, right? It's like we're slowly getting back a few pieces of data here and there. There were some states here in the Great Lakes region that were able to conduct their breeding population surveys. North Dakota, again, conducted theirs. I'm not sure on the status of any breeding population surveys from the northeastern U.S. states, if any of those were conducted. But as you mentioned, I think one of the states out west was able to conduct their survey. I could be wrong on that. But anyway, we're starting to get back a few pieces of data. Hopefully next year is going to be a full resumption of all of those activities. Getting back to the drought here, Ken, as you mentioned and as others have heard us talk about on several episodes, it is developing, has been developing for over a year across much of the prairies, the Canadian and U.S. prairies. Mike Szymanski gave us an excellent update on what they saw with in North Dakota, dramatic historic decline in the number of ponds from last year to this year. And we're going to be talking with Pat Kehoe here shortly about sort of a windshield assessment of pond conditions across the Canadian prairies. How is the drought factoring into your mind or into the process for setting regulations for next year? Because the drought that we're seeing right now is going to be affecting regulations for the 22-23 season. How's that playing in your mind and into the process right now?
Oh, it always causes me some concern, and it's always hard to see the Canadian prairies or U.S. prairies, go dry like that. But that is part of the natural cycle, and really what makes those wetlands so dynamic. And wetlands are duck numbers, duck populations are really able to respond in kind when the wetland numbers are right. So as much as it's difficult to see, it is part of that natural cyclic process that we're accustomed to up there. But how it affects harvest management, as I mentioned there before, we are incorporating some of that precipitation data into our recruitment models. So it really should be captured through that adaptive harvest management process, and that drought should factor into expected production and recruitment this year, and seasons should be adjusted accordingly. So I don't want to speculate too much on what the drought's going to mean for the 22-23 hunting seasons, but let's kind of let the process play out, see how the adaptive harvest management models update, and we should have that information available late July, early August. And then we will certainly have some really good discussions with our flyway partners on how to proceed there, given that technical recommendation. And then, as you know, Mike, often the next step there is to have that discussion with the Service Regulations Committee, and then make formal recommendations that will ultimately get codified in the regulations. So that's kind of where we stand. While the drought certainly causes me concern, but I think we're pretty early in the process for setting the 22-23 regulations, and we'll be guided hopefully by a lot of the data that will become available here over the next few months.
Fair enough. I won't make you speculate on what ifs and why fors and that type of thing just yet. That's as you've mentioned numerous times. Y'all set harvest regulations based on data in a very structured, informed manner, and I hope we can all appreciate that. We all lament the lack of data right now, but yeah, fair enough. I won't ask you to speculate too much on what will or what you think won't happen, but we will. Would you be willing to come back on with us later this year or early next year to give us a summary of how all that played out?
Absolutely. Always willing to talk about where we're at and how we make decisions and why we make the decisions that we do. So.
Moving on here to a couple of other issues, Ken, I did want to talk briefly about any type of other activities that may have been affected this year, like summer banding. We talked with Frank Baldwin about how the Canadian Wildlife Service's restrictions on field activity are affecting their ability to get up into the Arctic. There will be very limited Arctic goose banding this year, but they are hopeful that they will be able to band ducks later this summer. And so I wanted to get Fish and Wildlife Service's take on that as well. What type of activities are being planned in terms of summer banding effort for ducks?
Yeah, banding is also very much like May surveys, where we need to plan several months in advance to get our crews north of the 49th parallel and up there in Canada. So again, we're kind of hoping for the best, and we're hoping that we'll be able to get our crews up there. But the jury is still out on that one. I know we're talking daily with some of the folks in CWS, working on some contingency plans like we did last year. Watching the border status pretty closely. I know that's kind of being reviewed or updated on a monthly basis. We're all hoping that COVID numbers in Canada and the U.S. continue to trend in the right direction, and we see more freedoms when it comes to, or more liberties when it comes to things opening back up. So that's where we're at. Still don't have a final word on whether or not we'll be able to get U.S. crews across the border, but that's what we're planning for, and that will likely be a game time decision coming up sometime, next month. So we'll certainly see where we land with that one. But if we can't get up there and band, and I'm hopeful that CWS will be able to get back out in the field and run some banding stations, and then we will mobilize our crews here in the U.S. To hopefully continue to get the critical banding information that we need.
One final question here for you, Ken, and I just want to make sure we ask this and let you respond directly. Do we anticipate resuming these surveys next year, assuming COVID continues to ease? Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, and all the state partners are fully committed to resuming these surveys next year and getting back to the process?
Everybody that I've talked to that are involved in these cooperative survey efforts, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to the Canadian Wildlife Service to the states, we are all fully committed to doing all that we can to get back out in the field next year. This is just critical data for us, and it's really the foundation of making good decisions, and we want to get back to that operating status as soon as we can. So.
Well, that's music to my ears, and I'm sure that's going to be music to the ears of many of our listeners that do look so forward to that data every year. I mean, we tailor several magazine articles or magazine features around that every year, and so that's kind of thrown a wrench into some of our own internal planning just from that perspective. But we're going to fill that content with other material. So that's all well and good. That's a very minor concern in the grand scheme of things. Any final word for our listeners here, Ken, or regarding anything that we may not have covered that you wanted to share?
No, I think that's the key thing here. And like you said earlier, Mike, it's complex. It's not as straightforward as hopping in an airplane and flying across the border and counting a few ducks. And it does take a lot of coordination within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, and your state and provincial partners. And I know every single one of those folks is committed to working for the resource and the American and Canadian publics. And it just didn't work out for us this year, which is unfortunate. But again, we're looking out for the safety and well-being of the U.S. and Canadian public. And, from what we know from our long-term data sets, ducks are quite resilient. And while it's less than desirable, I think duck populations are going to be just fine. And even with the drought, I think they'll respond in kind when water returns to the prairies. Well,
with that, we've probably taken up enough of your time. I do want to thank you again very much for joining us here. You're a busy person. Us lining schedules up here is a challenge in itself, but I appreciate your persistence in doing so. That means a lot, and it tells me that it's important to you and your agency to get to help communicate on some of the work that's happening, and we're happy to be an avenue for helping in that communication. So thank you, Ken, and thanks to your agency for the continued work that y'all do to manage this resource.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's always a pleasure to take a break from the day-to-day bureaucracy and sit down there and talk with one of our conservation partners and talk about ducks and talk about issues that are near and dear to all of our hearts. So.
A special thanks to Ken Richkus, our guest on today's episode, the Chief of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Migratory Bird Management. We greatly appreciate his time and input. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the work that he does on these podcasts. And then to you, the listener, we thank you for your time, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks.